we're going to talk about. Here come the Lutherans. Milwaukee did not have any Lutherans around in the years before the land sale began. There just were a few scattered people, primarily Solomon Juneau and his family, who were basically fur traders who decided to stay. They were the first Europeans to actually decide to live here year-round. And for the first 5 years after the land sales began in 1835, from 1835 to 1840, there were no Germans yet and no other Lutherans around in that 5-year span. So the other denominations all got a jump. Now, Juneau was Catholic, so he gave he did a lot to get the Catholics in Milwaukee, and early on gave them a lot of land. So Milwaukee became an archdiocese really early, long before they had enough people, you might think, to justify that. And all along Wisconsin Avenue, there was every kind of Protestant church and Catholic church you could imagine, except Lutherans. For some reason, we did not break into the Grand Avenue, Wisconsin Avenue, till 1914. That's when Redeemer was planted there. And I have a really interesting aerial shot of Redeemer Lutheran Church around 1920 or so. That's pretty cool. So if you look at this 1840 map of the city, here's the Grand Avenue. The west side, Kilburn's side, had 3rd and Juneau, King and Juneau, as its sort of center node. That probably was the highest ground. You know, when the first settlers came here, some of the land was not suitable for building houses because there were very steep ridges and bluffs, and it was going to take some years for those to be graded flat enough to plat and to build houses. Some of the land was so low and swampy, you could not possibly put any buildings on. And until that had been filled in and dried out, that wasn't good for building either. So what you sort of are seeing here is where was the high ground at the very beginning. So our story's going to begin today in around 1840 when the Germans came. When the Germans did come, the inner part of the city had already been filled up. So there was a thin crust of Germans on the east side. This was called Division Street up here. Today it's called East Juneau Avenue. And the Germans who decided to live on the east side packed in here. But the main place where the Germans headed was the high ground northwest of 3rd and Juneau. This was the 2nd Ward, and this became the Lutheran part of Milwaukee. I showed you this before. These are the 8 townships of Milwaukee County, and in case you missed it when I showed it the first time, these are our 3 founders. The east side, Solomon Juneau; the west side, Byron Kilburn, and this is George Walker, the tubby Virginian who bought the land in what is now called Walker's Point. There was the city of Milwaukee and then 7 townships, none of which were incorporated, which meant that Milwaukee could gnaw onto them as they grew. Milwaukee, though, expanded very slowly, so slowly, in fact, that the packing of new residents into the city limits made Milwaukee, the city of Milwaukee at the turn of the century, the 2nd most densely packed urban area in the country, exceeded only by, you can guess what's number 1? Manhattan. We were 2nd to Manhattan in urban pack. The city just did not expand very fast. This is what Germany would have looked like in this time period in the late 1800s. Germany only became a country in 1871. Before that, they were a crazy quilt of small duchies, mini kingdoms, independent free cities, they were called. And they had various loose groupings depending on who was boss. The Holy Roman Empire was a sort of fictitious federation loosely containing the Germans. Napoleon invaded and took it all over and rebranded it as the German Confederation. Finally, Germany existed as a country in 1871. These are where the Lutherans were in 1850. This is where there were Lutheran churches in 1850. As you can see, the Germans were not sprinkled evenly when they immigrated into America. The Germans are from a northern country, or northern part of Europe, and they missed winter, and they just did not want to go to Florida, because frankly, Florida without air conditioning is just not worth it, is it? You can see the biggest wad of Germans in the early 1800s was in New York, Pennsylvania, the big wad of Germans here. A lot of Lutherans, most of whom today, whatever's left, has ended up in the ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. A big wad in Ohio. Indiana was soon going to have a lot of them. Here is, you can already see the effects of the Missouri Synod Saxons who came up the Mississippi in 1839. And you'll see the first little inklings that there's going to be Lutherans in Milwaukee and Ozaukee County. These are the Lutheran churches in 1872. You can see how rapidly the infill was, but you can also see that they're all in the northern half of the country. There's hardly any concentrations comparatively in the south compared to what the north had. So the Lutherans were a Midwest and northern phenomenon. Here's 1890. You can see a few concentrations in the Texas Hill Country. There's a few little concentrations dotted around the south. The Germans really, though, were not plantation owners. You don't hear of too many African Americans today, many of whom got their surnames from the plantation owners. You don't run into too many black folks with the last name of Schwarzkopf or Blumenthal, because they were mostly lived in the north. This is in 1900, a comparable map showing where the black folks in America lived. No surprise to you, concentrated in the south. This might also tell you why the Lutherans of the Midwest tended to be late to the game to really build a constituency between the Germans and the African Americans. They didn't live anywhere near each other, at least in our Wells world or in the Missouri Synod world. And it has only been over the passage of many decades that in the 1900s, the Great Migration started slowly encouraging black folks to leave the Jim Crow South and head north, which partly worked out for them, partly not, partly did. In fact, German is the largest ethnic ancestry in America, believe it or not. You can see them up in the upper Midwest is where they're strongest. Here's another map showing it from a little different way of tabulating the data. Here's where our story begins. This is a pastor in Germany. He ministered to a number of scattered flocks, but mainly in northeastern Germany, Pomerania and Saxony. His name is Johannes Grabau. And it was his fortune or misfortune to be pastoring at a time when being a Lutheran in the Northeast, where the Lutherans were really the strongest in Germany, that's where the Reformation took root most deeply in Luther's Saxony and in Pomerania. One of his co-workers they called him the apostle of the Pomeranians. And Pomerania in the Northeast really took to Lutheranism in a strong way. But the Prussian kings, this is before German unification, the kings of Prussia became enamored of an idea that they were tired of all this doctrinal arguing, and they were going to take all the Protestants and smush them together into one state church. It was called the Union, the Prussian Union. And some people liked that idea. It made sense to them, and they didn't care. They weren't very doctrinal, and they just thought, good, we'll all be together and there won't be any arguing. You've probably had discussions with friends of yours like that already, like, why can't we all just get together? All of these scatterings of churches, what a waste. Well, some people thought that back then, but there were people who cared about teaching, and one of the flashpoints, of course, was the doctrine of the Lord's Supper. Are you really eating and drinking this a sacrament, or is it just a memorial meal? Is this just a wafer and a sip of wine, or is it the body and blood of Christ himself given and poured out for you on the cross? And those arguments were not reconciled back then, and they still aren't today. I suspect there will still be arguing about that when Christ returns. But the point is that there were a lot of very uneasy and unhappy forced unions. And a lot of the Lutherans who cared the most, they were nicknamed the Old Lutherans because they were perceived as being old-fashioned. They just wouldn't do it. They would meet privately. They'd meet in a field if they had to. They would just not do this union stuff. And the government first warned them, or first they talked politely and scolded them a little and invited and talked pretty to them. Then they started warning them. Then the civil penalties started to stack up. And people like Pastor Grabau started experiencing jail time, confiscation of their possessions, and threats of police action to break up their old Lutheran organizations. And finally, Grabau and he had a following in the northeast of Germany. They finally had it up to here, and they said, we're emigrating. We're getting out of here. There's no hope, no future for what we're trying to do with Lutheranism. We have to get out of here and start over. And so they did. He and several thousand other Pomeranians and Saxons moved in several shiploads to the port of New York. And they didn't linger in the city. They headed across the state, and they had found that there were some Germans in Buffalo, New York. And so the main group dropped their possessions, bought up some land in Buffalo, and started building there and building a German Lutheran community in Buffalo. And they were called Old Lutherans. This is Martin Luther Church on the left, and then their school on the right. Very big into education. And Grabau also built a seminary. This is the seminary for the denomination or church body that was born out of their work. Does anybody know what would attract somebody to Buffalo? Today it's a bit of a joke. The only thing anybody knows about Buffalo is they've got a generally pretty decent football team, and it snows a lot. That's about all anybody knows. What was the significance that made Buffalo look like a great place to plant?
Erie Canal.
Yes, the canal. Buffalo for a while was having a moment because it was the crossroads of America. It's how goods and stuff from the eastern slopes of the mountains through the canal got west of the mountains, and now it could be distributed through the Great Lakes. And you could sail all the way down Lake Erie. Lake Erie became a huge pond of business, and then the other lakes too. Then Huron and Michigan got sort of looped into that and ultimately served Milwaukee. That means also all the produce from the west, all the lumber and mining materials and metals could go east. And Buffalo was the transshipment point where all of that, and all the people traveling and all the settlers would want to come through because they're right on that dang canal. So from New York, you could take the Hudson River up to Albany, get on a barge in Albany, and you could take water all the way to Buffalo, and then you could keep the water trip going all the way down Lake Erie. It was actually a pretty brilliant place to go. But not all the people wanted to stay in New York. A chunk of several hundred of them detached and came to Wisconsin, where they heard you could buy land much cheaper. There were reasons for that, of course. Can you guess why land was so much cheaper in Wisconsin? Number one, it hadn't been cleared yet. So you were going to be busting rocks and cutting trees for quite a while. And second, you might have to persuade some Indians who were residually angry about the Black Hawk defeat, and you weren't totally sure if you were going to be having any conflicts with the Native Americans. So I think it was about $5 an acre. If you contracted to farm it for 5 years, you could buy land for $5 an acre. That was a crazy dream for Germans, where the average farm size in Germany at that time, because of their inheritance laws, was 1.5 acres. You can't hardly even feed your own family on 1.5 acres. and farmers were desperate, and there was nowhere to go. So they emigrated to the U.S. Midwest in great numbers. So a big chunk of these people from Buffalo, these Grabau Saxons, moved to Wisconsin, and they planted a church in 1839, the first known Lutheran congregation in the state of Wisconsin was planted by these Buffalo folks, and they chose a place that they called the Freedom City, the Free City. They gave it a name for their settlement. Yes, Beth knows the name of it. It was called Freistadt. And for the longest time, that German name stuck. In fact, most of the locals still call it that area Freistadt. The church they founded is still there. It's in the Missouri Synod now, and they call themselves Trinity Mequon. But everybody really knows, no, that's really Trinity Freistadt. And this was their first pastor. Now, I used to be pretty hard on this guy because he was a big tubby jack and was very, very hard on his congregation. His boss, Pastor Grabau, viewed himself as a bishop in anything that the Word of God did not settle already, any of the debatable things. You and I think that means we as individuals, if it's not in the Bible, we have the freedom of conscience to have our own views. Grabau said, no, my little people. If it's not determined by the Bible, I will make the decision for you. So your job is just to obey. Now you can guess how well that went over. He at least had some brilliance and skill. Also, I want to throw him some props for having courage. He had spent time in jail for his Lutheran beliefs, and he fled a unionistic situation to plant an actual Lutheran denomination that was based on the Lutheran confessional writings, the Book of Concord. He gets some, we should clap and cheer for that. That was something. And that, how does it not warp you a little bit when you've been persecuted like that? But anyway, this guy had all those bishopy kind of ideas, but did not have Grabau's modicum of grace and personality, and just became a boss and a tyrant. Trinity Freistadt was founded in 1839. There were some of the Buffalo people who ended up in the city, and 2 years later, they founded the very first Lutheran church in the city of Milwaukee called St. Paul's. And he was pastor of both of them. He was not provided with a horse. Now, mentally think about the geography between 4th and, or let's say 4th and State, which is where that Milwaukee congregation started meeting. They didn't have their own building for 30 years, but they met in rented quarters. So think of 4th and State in Milwaukee, just south of the Big Taco, the Pfizer Forum, and 76th and Freistadt Road in Mequon. But you have no horse. The automobile is still 70 years from being available in Milwaukee. So they expected him to walk. He didn't like that one bit. That would take you all day just to get from one place to the other, maybe. Yeah. Nobody, yeah, you could jog, I suppose. Nobody, apparently, he would try to scrounge drives. But he started laying it on the people's consciences that they had to contribute. He would tax them a certain amount for his horse fund. And that didn't set too well with people because most of them were dirt poor. They were in survival mode. They had expended whatever capital they had to buy land, and they were dirt poor. And they resented his heavy-handed ways. He threatened excommunication if you didn't pay your horse tax for his hoped-for horse. And that was too much. Even though he had a monopoly on Lutheranism in Milwaukee County and Ozaukee County at that time, there was already trouble brewing, and he was going to cause the very first church split in Wisconsin Lutheranism. And a whole chunk of his membership split off and called themselves First Lutheran, which I find so ironic because they were second, not first. But I think that name was chosen on purpose because they wanted to be. We're the real founders. Tubby Jerk over here is just an interloper. It's really our congregation. We're just reestablishing our congregation. Well, his name was Leberecht Fürchte Gott Ehrenfried Krause. Leberecht Fürchte Gott Ehrenfried Krause. What a mouthful, huh? There is a beautiful historical park next to the church in Freistadt, and they have collected a whole lot of, it's like a museum of farming life, what it was like in 1840 when the church was founded. So you can visit this if you ever want. It's on the grounds of Trinity. This is a replica of their first log cabin where the very first Lutheran services in Wisconsin took place. Here's the church today, beautiful building made of stone. Back in town, this is the center of Kilburn Town. This is the old 3rd Street looking southward. This would be in about 3rd and Highland, 3rd and Highland. This was a railroad terminal for the Milwaukee and La Crosse Railroad, which was one of the first railroads to link the two ends of the state in 1853. Alexander Mitchell ended up owning it and made a ton of money off of it. The people at St. Paul's bounced around for about, if they started in 1841, almost 30 years. Because Krause was such a poor leader, the leadership there was so jumbled and convoluted, they had trouble really getting going. People kept breaking off. When the Missouri Synod opened up a church in 1847, another big chunk of disgruntled people peeled off of St. Paul's and joined the Missouri Synod. But finally, they put a core together and built the first decent-looking church building in Milwaukee among the Lutherans in 1870. This is St. Paul's. It was on 7th and Galena, only about 2 blocks away from St. John's on the Hillside, the Wells Church. We used to call it 8th and Vliet. Now it's called St. John's on the Hillside. This was just a couple of blocks away. But they grew enough. They also, besides the Freistadt Church and the City Church, they also planted 3 country congregations. One in the tiny little burg of Cedarburg, one in the township of Lebanon. Do you know where Lebanon is? It's a dinky little township outside of Watertown, about 10 miles away from Watertown. And one in Jackson, which the old-timers there don't call Jackson. They named the church David's Star. It's called by its old name of the church meadow, Kirchhain. If you say you go to David's Star in Kirchhain, all of the old-timers up there know what you mean. So they now had 5 churches. Here's some good news and some bad news. The good news is there were now enough churches in Grabau's movement to form a denomination, to work cooperatively and have some oversight. And they decided they were going to name it the Buffalo Synod because that's where Martin Luther, Old Lutheran Church, and Martin Luther Seminary were located, and where Grabau, the boss, had sunk down his roots. But where did they have their founding convention? Right here in Milwaukee. You knew I was going to say that. It was founded in Milwaukee, but it's called the Buffalo Synod. That's the good news. The bad news is, because of people like Krause, they never grew. The churches that they planted were always smallish, and there were never any more Buffalo Synod churches in Wisconsin, just those 5. Isn't that crazy? There was growth in the Buffalo Synod, but it came out of Buffalo, not out of the group here in Wisconsin. So this is St. Paul's on 7th and Galena. In about 1917, they got tired of that location and bought a congregational church on Wisconsin Avenue, thus becoming the second Lutherans to be on Grand Avenue. They thought that would be a big move up in visibility. So they sold their church. This is the front porch, and those aren't Lutheran pastoral robes from the day. This is now the St. Joseph's Croatian church that bought their building on 7th and Galena. The Croatians have since moved westward. You probably never have seen it because If you are driving west on Wells Street at about 46th or so, around in there, there's a bulge in the bluffs overlooking the Menominee Valley, and there's enough room back there to actually have a neighborhood and a church. And this Croatian church is up there, that's where they moved from here. But it was interesting that the Croatians moved in. And this is the church St. Paul's bought. It was a Congregationalist church that went out of business, probably because it had been a competition church for the big stone one. Do you know what's now the Irish Cultural Center in Milwaukee? That magnificent building with some truly spectacular glass was once the Grand Avenue Congregational Church. If I had this little runty building, I would have trouble competing with that big stone pile also, I think. But the Lutherans weren't done with this thinking. They wanted mainly the location, and the layout was okay. But after 15 years of working in ministry in that building, they rebuilt it in beautiful golden Lannenstone. And that building is still there. It's on 28th and Wisconsin. The church has seen better days. According to the ELCA's website, they only get about 30 to 35 people in worship on a weekend. This is Adolf Kinderman. He was the pastor of the 3 country churches. One of those 3 country churches ended up in the ELCA. The one out in Lebanon ended up in the Missouri Synod, and the one in, I think that's right, and the one in Jackson, in Kirchhain, ended up in the Wells, believe it or not. So David Starr, the Wells Church in Jackson, actually was originally a Buffalo Synod congregation. As I told you, this was the second oldest church, but they called themselves First Lutheran. I have not been able to unearth any photographs so far, and in fact, I only luckily tripped over a Google search of something way down. You know how many, sometimes you got to click, you can click on 100 different layers of suggestions for you. I was deep into the dozens when I stumbled on the history of First Lutheran. I had never seen it before. It was not signed, so I can't verify a darn thing. I would love to give credit to somebody. But a guy named Gottfried Klügel, who never managed to get himself ordained by Dr. Walther in St. Louis, but had some letters showing that Walther liked him and generally approved of him, was called to pastor the angry bunch of people who split off from Krause's heavy-handed threats of excommunication if you don't allow him to tax you for his horse fund. And they formed a group called First Lutheran, and they never really had a serious building. They bounced around, and this was their last serious building. So it was basically a big wooden frame building. And this picture was taken in 1925. I know that because the hot movie in town, What Price Glory, came out in 1925. And also the car on the left suggests it. And that trailer, that work trailer on the right, is the demolition contractor. I think somebody snapped a picture right before it was demolished. So this was the place where they were founded, where First Lutheran was founded. And if any of you ever find an actual picture of First Lutheran's church, I will buy you all the beer you can drink in one sitting. This little humble cottage is the beginning of the next one. By the way, it's an arbitrary decision of mine how you count Milwaukee churches. So I'm counting all the ones that are within the city limits today. The original city, of course, was much smaller. So this is, back then, was in the town of Greenfield, but now it's in Milwaukee. This is my home congregation, St. John's Root Creek. The old-timers call it Root Creek, not Root Creek. It is Root Creek. Mary Snell is one of us. This tiny little frame cabin was where worship began. 1846. This was their second building, built in the 1870s. That was their, on Sunday mornings, it was their chapel, and then during the week it was their schoolhouse, 68th and Forest Home. This building, where I grew up worshiping, was built in 1896. It's substantially still in existence. It's been altered somewhat, but the basic outline of the building is still there. The building has lost some of the trim, but I have the most amazing thing to relate to you. I was at a pastor's afternoon gathering, sipping a few beers on a summer afternoon, and Pastor Bitter was there, the pastor of the church, and I'm staring at the roof of the church because we're sitting in his backyard, and I'm staring at the roof of the church. It looked exactly like the roof that I remembered when I was a boy, sitting in that same backyard, though not drinking beer. Well, maybe I did drink a little beer back there. And I said, is that the original roof? Because it's that diamond pattern, and it was very stained. You could see where there was water streaks, but apparently it was watertight. He said, yeah, it's the original roof. I lay that out to you as a miracle. It's like a weeping statue of the Madonna. This is a Lutheran miracle that roof has been on there since 1896, and it's still keeping them watertight. So as far as I know, they have no plans to replace the roof. That is beyond belief. Here's the house where I grew up. I was outraged when I learned it had been demolished because it had been my quiet plan to turn that into my library and museum. And I was not consulted when the demolition orders were given place. A year later, 1847, a group of Missouri Synod Saxons got together on 4th Street. Again, nobody could afford real estate. No church could afford real estate on 3rd Street because that was the expensive commercial street. But one street in, all the early churches on the west side all started on 4th Street. It's kind of crazy. So they named it Trinity, named after, in the Wells, the most famous church name, the most common church name is St. John's. In the Missouri Synod, because the original mother church of the entire Missouri Synod in St. Louis is Trinity, every Missouri Synod church to be the first in a town always calls itself Trinity. So this is Trinity, Milwaukee. They got a bigger building. This is still on 4th Street. This also, by the way, is where the first high school, Lutheran high school in Milwaukee, had a brief start. It didn't last. They called it the Realschule, and they just could not get enough money, faculty and students together in a sustainable manner, and that effort collapsed. A few years later, in 1881, the South Wisconsin District, or the Wisconsin District of Missouri, launched Concordia as a prep school. They had a very distinguished member at this time. One of Krause's original members at St. Paul's was a guy who ended up in the hardware business. His name was John Pritzloff. He couldn't stand Krause and joined First Lutheran, but he didn't like Gottfried Kliegel too much either and joined Trinity, and he got to like it a lot. And this was his first major hardware store right here. This is John Pritzloff's hardware store. It was built in about 1860, early 1860s. Do anybody recognize what this is? You might have been in there. That's Mater's Restaurant. This is on 3rd Street. This building is still here, by the way. You can still see it. John Pritzloff's hardware store. Business was good. This was his new site on Plankinton Avenue. About 2/3 of those buildings have been demolished, but this massive piece is still there, and there's no hardware business been going on in there for quite a while. However, it is now a banquet facility called the Pritzloff, and I wonder if any of you have ever been to a wedding or a gathering at the Pritzloff. It's really beautiful. John Pritzloff became a multimillionaire, even in that much more highly appreciated money, and he donated the land and probably much of the money for Trinity Church. When they were ready to take down that medium-sized wooden building, they put up a church worthy of the King of Kings. This is Trinity, downtown Trinity. It is a spectacular building. It was designed by their carpenter contractor, Frederick Velgut, who also was a pretty decent designer. It's a stunningly beautiful building, now turned black because of all the coal soot in Milwaukee's air. Originally, it was creamy yellow, made of Cream City brick. Here's their school a block away. on 8th Street. A little farther north is St. John's on Vliet, on 8th and Vliet. They lost their school long ago, never got it back. Here was their interior before the fire. Absolutely a riot. It's like a museum of German-American woodcarvers' art. It's spectacular oak carving, just beautiful. That curving staircase leading up to the pulpit could be in a museum all by itself. Beautiful quarter-sawn oak paneling in their balcony. They had a big three-manual Schulke organ, one of the biggest ones ever built by Milwaukee's earliest famous builder, William Schulke. Some of you remember that sad day. Apparently, a fire was started by roofers, one of whom had a hot tool of some kind. Maybe they were using some solder, hot solder, or had a blowtorch or something and laid something down that was hot, and that old wood caught on fire. And before they knew it, you had a multi-alarm fire going on, and it destroyed the roof and the right tower, the south tower. Sad, sad, sad. It's being rebuilt, though. They got insurance settlements from both Church Mutual and the insurers for the roofing contractor. And Carol and I were in it. We heard a concert in December. They're probably about 2/3 of the way of rebuilding the inside. The way I hear the story, there is not enough money to rebuild that tower. So like some churches in Europe, they're going to have an amputee. It's going to be stubbed off, and there will only be the main tower left. 1847, that same year, a church was built out in the sticks in the town of Granville, became known as Salem. Although it didn't have the name Salem right away, it was just called the German Lutheran Church in Granville, and actually was called the German Lutheran and Reformed Church of Granville. This was a union church when it started. And although it sounds beautiful, we should all get together, all they did was fight. And after 15 years, they finally just gave it up. And the Calvinists, who really saw themselves as Presbyterian Calvinists, moved across the street, built the West Granville Presbyterian Church in 1861, and have been happily about their business ever since, leaving the Lutherans behind. This is their old church building, still standing, built in 1863. Here's the only known photograph of the inside of that building. Interestingly enough, the Salem Landmark Board of Directors hired Benj Lorenz, who besides being a terrific guitarist is also a phenomenal cabinet maker, to make a duplicate of this altar, and it's now in the Landmark Church. Very beautiful. 1847, there you can see it. The stained glass is not original. That was put in the 20s. Probably would have been just clear pane at the time. These people were not very wealthy. They were farmers. Back in town in 1848, a cranky group of independent-minded Lutherans got together, and they didn't want to join this newfangled Missouri Synod. They had had enough of getting bossed around by denominations. So they started an independent Lutheran church, and they called themselves Sankt Johannes, St. John's. And they started in 1848. 3 years later, they had a great stroke of luck, or maybe God's crazy blessings. The Episcopalians had built a mission church on the west side to reach out to their new German immigrants and neighbors to do mission work among the Germans, and it bombed. But their bad news is our good news. St. John's bought the building. It's a very nice building for the time. This is in 1852. This photograph was probably taken in the early 1860s. You can see no paved streets yet. The streets are just dirt. Every time it rained, you were in mud up to your ankles. But this lovely building on 4th and Highland, it's in the Deer District now. It's soon going to, if it isn't already, it's going to be built over with hotels. There soon won't be any place to stand around and have a watch party. Plus, the Bucks probably aren't going to be in the finals of the NBA anytime soon. So that's okay. So then that's where this was located. Here is Howard Heston's 1872 drawing. You can see the church here, and you can see the school buildings right here. They were big into education right out of the chute. You can also see how tightly packed the neighborhood was. And it was very crowded very soon. And already by the 1870s, they were aware that they had got to expand somewhere else, so they started saving money. That incidentally became the impetus to building a branch school across 3rd Street, on the other side of 3rd Street, which became St. Marcus. More on that next week. Here's an 1880s drawing of the block. Here you can see St. John's and its school. Right here you can see how packed everything is. This is like Manhattan, one building side by side, cheek by jowl with another. All of these buildings are gone. Everything's gone. This block has a remarkable number of buildings intact. And here is Turner Hall, towering over the neighborhood like a secular shepherd, inviting all the people, especially the Germans, to come in and work out and be fit. Here is 1872. This is when they're deciding to build the branch school that became St. Marcus. And my hunch is that these are all the worshipers on a Sunday, and they shooed everybody out into the street, packed them all together, and somebody climbed up into the Turner Hall, which is about halfway down the block, and maybe had a zoom lens on the camera, and they zoomed up and took a picture of the worshipers. This would be approximately the 25th anniversary of their founding back in 1848 or so. Here is their pastor, Johannes Bading. In the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, probably one of the 3 most important leaders in the Wells. Our dominant stories tend to be about the theologians who got the Wells' head straight about who we were and did the teaching. But as far as congregational leaders, congregational pastors, this guy is probably at the top of the mountain. He was the synod president in 2 different shifts. He was the president of Northwestern College's board of directors from 1865 until 1908. I am not making that up. He was the boss of Northwestern College. And those 2 guys down here, by the way, stood there throughout the whole sermon. It was their job. They had a stick. You don't see the stick, but they would poke people who were dozing off, and they would glare down and stare down any naughty children. They were the elders who were enforcing discipline. So I think we could probably use a pair of guys. I'll take volunteers after the service. That was a banner. It says, Gottes Wort und Luthers Lehre vergeht nun und nimmermehr. May God's word and Luther's teachings never pass away. This might have been, because they wouldn't have always had that bunting up and stuff like that, that might have been taken during their anniversary year in 1872.
That's where the Synodical Conference was formed. When Walther finally felt he could trust us, the meeting was there. The service was held in that building underneath Pfizer Forum. And so that was a very big day. And that was Missouri's slogan.
Yes.
God's word and Luther's teaching shall
do forever. Yes. Back then, Walther in the Missouri Synod had tried to basically annex the Wells and just make us one of the districts in their synod. And the Wells was a little too scared of that, a little standoffish, and said, "No, let's just be friends. Can we just hold hands a little bit? We don't have to consummate this. Let's just you can kiss me goodnight. That's it." And that's how it stayed. But when Walther gave up on that, he said, "Well, can we just be in a loose federation?" And that we thought that we can do. So that was called the Synodical Conference. Initially had 6 or 7 synods, then it whittled down to 4, and then the Wells and the ELS bailed in 1963, and it dissolved in 1965. Very sad. A lot of good stuff came out of that. That's subject. Next summer, we'll have Pastor Brown come and tell us the story of the Synodical Conference. There were some very wealthy members at St. John's. This is Ferdinand Kiekhaefer. Lutheranism would not be possible without the work of the Kiekhaefer brothers. This was their original factory downtown. You can see on Clybourne Street here, these numbers are very low. So they're just south of the Grand Avenue in downtown. But if I tell you the name, the new name, when they got a national affiliation, it was called the National Enameling and Stamping Company. They made tinware for kitchen goods. Back before there was plastic, every storage bin had to be made out of metal, and it had to be cheap metal and it couldn't rust. So it was called Japan finish to keep it from rusting, or it was painted or coated in various ways. So have you figured out what do we still use today constantly here at St. Marcus? In fact, you'll use it tonight, descended from the National Enameling and Stamping Company. The Nesco slow cookers were developed out of this man, and he richly deserves all his wealth. Here's their new factory.
So that those buildings took up an entire city block?
Oh yeah, and this took up like 2 blocks. St. Paul Avenue from 9th all the way to 10th Street. That was a great place to be, because just down the hill were railroad tracks and the canals, so you could ship your goods out, ship in your raw materials, and you could use rail to bring your stuff in. This is what St. John's looked like probably right when they're going through their punch list. You can see the last of the steeplejacks are putting the top cross on. This was Bodding's parsonage right here. This is what it looked like from up on top of the massive chimney at the Pabst Brewery 2 blocks away. And you can see it's still creamy looking. It turned black from soot, Milwaukee's dirty air, but originally it was as creamy yellow as any of our beautiful Cream City brick buildings. But you can also see if they thought they were escaping congestion, they didn't go far enough, because that neighborhood was tightly packed. Nobody had a yard in this neighborhood on the hillside. There were no yards, because if you had enough room behind your house, you would build a cottage to get a rental property and get some more income. You can see they still have their beautiful lights. They never put chandeliers in. Their church is illuminated by bulbs. St. Marcus used to have that too. You probably didn't know that. In 1949, the last year, we had rows of light bulbs that lit the church. And in 1950, the people on the building committee said, "We're sick of these light bulbs. I hate changing those suckers. They're impossible to... How do you get up there? This is nuts. Every decent church has chandeliers." Here's their bell tower. Made in Milwaukee. Now we're on to Grace, 1849. Here is the oldest picture I've ever been able to find of Grace Lutheran Church. 1854, this drawing was done, like an imagined aerial drawing if you were a pigeon or something. And this is the north end of Juneautown. Here's Juneau Avenue running right up here. Here you can see the convent, the gigantic convent. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But you see this little thing here looking like a small Roman temple to the goddess Minerva. That is actually Grace Lutheran Church from the backside of what it would have looked like back then. Grace was founded in 1849, and they built their building only a year later. There was enough money on the east side that they could do a major brick construction project after only 1 year. That speaks very highly of the organizational ability of their pastor, John Milhäuser, who became the first synod president. Here is a photo of Grace in about middle 1860s. You can tell from the hoop skirts on the women. You can also tell these are the first gas lamps that have been installed in Milwaukee. A few lucky streets got nighttime illumination. Milwaukee used to be as dark as any country road, just complete darkness. Whatever light shone from candles or kerosene lamps out of people's houses was the only illumination. Obviously not very safe. A lot of crime went on under cover of darkness. It was considered a big modern civic advance for Milwaukee to get gas. And Milwaukee did not have gas pumped from gas wells. It was synthetic gas. It was made from coal. And there was a gigantic, stanky gas production plant at the south end of the 3rd Ward. And nobody wanted to live there because it stank to high heaven. but the people were mighty glad for the gas. And that also would be how churches like this one and St. Marcus's first buildings were illuminated also with city gas. Notice also that they only had 4 bays. As a nifty little expansion strategy, they added a 5th bay and extended the altar wall back to get more seating in this building. This was taken in the 1890s because this church would be demolished in 1899, and their school building right here had been built in 1893. You can also see, even today, Juneau Street runs downhill really rapidly to the river. Here it is from the front. Here's their inside. Back in 1850, the Wisconsin Synod was not very high church. In fact, our worship style would have been called pietistic, and we didn't have altars, very significant altars, at the very beginning. And Salem's was like that too. There was a very small table under here. That was their altar. The pulpit was the main thing in the Reformed churches that contributed to the flavor of the early wells. The sermon was the main thing. It was the main act, and communion was a sort of a sideshow. So the pulpit got a pride of place. Here's their school. These are just girls. Grace had a big school. It died during the Depression. Ada Hagedorn, a few of you might remember Ada. She taught there at that school. She passed away in about 1990 or so. She was still angry till the day she died that Grace closed its school. She stayed angry for 70 years. There used to be a joke Pastor Hebner would tell when he gave people tours of Grace that there was a beer line that ran from the Blatz Brewery across the street, and that Grace was able to tap into it, and they had a tapper in the pastor's office in the basement. I always thought that was just for the tourists. Actually, this is from the 1894 Sanborn map. You can't read this because it's too small, but it says water and beer pipeline, and it ran from the brewery here to their bottling house. Here is Grace Church right here. It would take nothing to just run a little T, just put a little T line in here. In 1901, they built their beautiful new building. There was such wealth at that time on the east side, and people who came over from the west side, that they went around the church council table and got pledges from the church councilman first, and they had the entire cost of the building pledged just by their church councilman. There was no need for a fund drive. It was all paid for in advance. Those towers rotted out and were replaced by stubbier, simpler ones today. A magnificent building, one of the most beautiful in the entire Synod. This is their leading lay member. This is George Brumder. George Brumder was the head of a massive publication empire in the German language. And he issued the largest German language newspaper in America. And back in the immigrant days, a lot of people were not able to or did not want to read their news in English. They wanted it in German. And so his paper was called the Germania. This was his publishing house on Plankinton. The building's no longer there. But it was way too small. He outgrew it, and he built this fabulous new building, which is still there. It's that building with the Prussian helmets, the Pickelhaube helmets on the corners. It has been redone about 15 or 20 years ago. It is beautiful today. It's worth stepping inside and just having a look at its beauty. A beautiful job. Eugene Liebert, the German architect in Milwaukee, designed it. And just a quick little detour. Within 1 block of Grace, that big church, stuff that changed all of Milwaukee was taking place within just a block. This is, as I said, you remember I said a thin crust of Germans settled along Juneau Street on the east side? This was called the German Market, and that was such a success they rebuilt it. This is the 1870s model. The previous one was the 1860s model. This is Juneau Street as it runs towards the river. The only thing left is this building right here, which is now called Duke's on Water. It's a bar. Used to be a bank, now it's a bar. This was called the German Market. 1 block away on Milwaukee Street is what's called the Female College, Milwaukee Female College, started by the wife of a Congregationalist pastor in 1852, and it became Milwaukee's leading women's college. Only a few women were blessed to be able to go there, of course. College education for women took a while to build momentum, but by golly, by 1852, Milwaukee had a very nice-looking college. Here's another look at it. Very beautiful neighborhood. That became Downer College, or Downer Seminary first, then Downer College, and that was one of the amalgamating institutions that became UWM. Correct. So that started 1 block away from Grace. A few houses north of Grace on Broadway was Peter Engelmann's Schule, and he started a German elementary and high school that became very popular and famous. The Germans were good educators. They cared passionately about education, and that school was a magnet. There's Peter Engelmann in 1867. That grew so big it became the German English Academy. That building's still standing on Broadway. And then that morphed into the Country Day School, which today is known as University School, USM. By some measures, the elite high school of the Milwaukee area. This is the convent, the Catholic convent of the School Sisters of Notre Dame. They were primarily teachers. An army, while the Wells was trying to scrape together enough money to actually be able to call a pastor, the Catholics had an army of teaching nuns who worked for peanuts, and they housed them here. This building was built in the early 1850s. You think I'm making this up. There was a gigantic convent housing also a high school for girls, St. Mary's Academy. Solomon Juneau donated all the land, and they made a killing on it until they didn't. In about 1958 or 60 or so, the nuns had all moved away, and that was all destroyed. It's now called Convent Hill, but only a few history nerds actually know that there was actually a convent there one time, and it was an enormous leverage for the mission of the Catholic Church. You're standing on Brewer's Hill on our side of the river, looking across the Milwaukee River. This, by the way, is the Borchert Brewery right here. Got to have beer. This is the mansion of Adolf Meinecke on Milwaukee Street. Adolf Meinecke had a huge toy company, which is still standing. The building is still standing across Wells Street from the Pabst Theater. There's this great big Victorian building, beautiful old building in excellent shape. That was Adolf Meinecke's toy factory. He also had a willow factory. Back then, willow furniture was having a moment. Willow chairs and willow outdoor tables and all that stuff. Plus, baby carriages were all made out of like straw type stuff, and straw seating on chairs. And little girls' doll carriages were also made out of willow ware. So he was a wealthy guy and had a fabulous house 1 block east of Grace. This was David Ferguson's house, basically across the street from the female seminary, the female college. David, isn't that a spectacular house? Jeepers, would I have loved to have a glass of whiskey with David Ferguson. He was Alexander Mitchell's #1 assistant. Mitchell was the richest man in Wisconsin. David Ferguson made a gigantic pile also. This is on Broadway and Knapp, just up the block from Grace. This is Annunciation Greek Orthodox Church, the original one. They have since demolished that building and built a Frank Lloyd Wright spaceship out on about 92nd Street. Have you ever seen Annunciation, the spaceship today? Now we go to the south side, 1852. That's the Scandinavian Lutheran Church, mainly Norwegians, but they took all Scandinavians because there weren't so many. One of the unique things about Wisconsin is the very first Norwegian language worship service in the New World took place in Wisconsin. The Norwegians are all sailors. You think they'd have stopped first and had settlements on the Atlantic coast? Wrong. They all went 1,000 miles west before they stopped the wagons. Who knows where that first Norwegian church was built? It's not Milwaukee. Over a decade earlier, in the early 1840s. Anybody know? I'm sorry, what? Close. You're pretty close. Wind Lake. And in fact, their original congregation, to this day called Norway Lutheran, is still a viable ELCA congregation. And their original log cabin, the first Norwegian language Lutheran congregation, that whole thing was jacked up and put on a trailer and schlepped up to the Norwegians' most beloved place in Minnesota, the grounds of Luther Seminary in St. Paul. And that original Norwegian log cabin can still be viewed today. They reassembled it. It's really big. It's like a 2-story cabin. This building is still standing. It's still there. It was a candy factory for a while. The church outgrew it. They did really well in the 20s. They had a pastor named Gustav Stearns who absolutely killed it as far as reputation. This is Ascension's new digs on Layton Boulevard. And interestingly enough, next door is their synod headquarters. This is the headquarters of the Greater Milwaukee Synod. The church has shrunk way down. They don't even get 100 people on Sunday anymore. This is the Missouri Synod's mothership on the south side. St. Stephen's was built in 1850, or was founded in 1854. There's their school. My mother went to grades 5 through 8 at that school. The Wells and Missouri interchangeably used each other's schools back then. This is, in 1858, these were the Low Church Norwegians. The Norwegian Synod were more high church. These were the lay preachers and the less liturgical Lutherans, sometimes called the Haugians. This is called Vorfrelser, Our Savior Lutheran Church. They were located on 9th and Scott. My grandfather was the pastor of St. Peter's, the Wells Church around the corner, and he hated those guys because when my grandfather would threaten the lodge members at St. Peter's and tell them, we're going to kick you out if you don't get out of the lodge, and they called his bluff, and he kicked them out. Vorfrelsers would vacuum them up, and they built up their membership that way, and it just to drive him crazy. In the 1950s, they moved to Wisconsin Avenue to raise their profile, and they did really well until they didn't, and they closed 2 years ago. They had a magnificent 3-manual Cassavant organ in that big space. The organ has been removed, it's gone somewhere. It's used as a high school now. I can't imagine that's a very efficient use of space, but we heard a magnificent Paul Mons concert in this building. This is 1860. St. Peter's Little House Church began on 8th and Scott. That's their second church. Here's their third and present-day church built in 1885. 1863, this is St. John's on Good Hope Road. They later built a newer church on Clinton Avenue on the other side of their cemetery, so they weren't on Good Hope anymore. We used to call them St. John's Clinton. And then they merged with North Trinity when North Trinity went out of business, and they refurbished their building. So the congregation is still in business today. That building's long gone. They call themselves Loving Shepherd Lutheran Church. Their school died, though, alas. 1865, on 10th and Garfield, St. Matthew's began. This is their tiny little beginning chapel. In 1870, they built, at that early date, probably the earliest decent-looking church in the Wells in Milwaukee, 10th and Garfield. Their school was an amalgam. You can see they made it do. The top half of the T part, the staff part of the T, is actually their old church. Can you see it? Can you see the old church outlines? And they just jacked it up and built another story underneath and then put a cross the T on the back and made a school out of it. They were big into school. St. Matthew's got very big. At one time, they had over 2,000 members until they didn't. And then they've been trying to move out to the west side for probably 30 years and finally pulled the trigger in the early 1960s, built a new campus on 84th and Malvina, built a big Quonset hut for their gym, and thought, we'll temporarily worship in the gym till we can build a church. They never built a church. So now the Quonset hut gym has been redecorated and is their church building, and then they have since built a gym. And then the school closed, and now it's taken over by Mount Lebanon. This is like a soap opera. And if you look real close, you can see right here it says St. Philip. Believe it or not, when St. Philip's got founded in 1955, they first met in a broom factory. And when St. Matthew's moved out, this became their second church home. So for about 3 years, St. Philip's used their beautiful worship building and school. And one of my first road basketball games in my life was playing in 1965 on the St. Marcus B team in their Cracker Box gym, the smallest large closet that ever masqueraded as a gym in Wells Lutheran School basketball history. You could not have any arch on your shot because you'd hit the ceiling. This is Garfield Avenue in 1894. Here was St. Matthew's, which was, the city said, we're building a freeway, you better get out. So St. Philip's had to move out. The land is still there. They would not have had to demolish that beautiful church building. 1 block away is Emmanuel Lutheran Church. The Missouri Synod planted it right about that same time in 1865 as the Missouri Synod's second Lutheran church on the north side. This was their rather nice-looking building, probably built around probably in the late 1860s. And then you think, holy smokes, they blew it away and built a cathedral in its place. Actually not. This is the back end of the building, and it's the same as always. They just put an impressive new facade on with 2 ginormous towers. This became one of the largest churches in the Missouri Synod. They had over 3,000 members in the 1800s. Here's what the inside looked like. Here's their school. This is where the Lutheran High School began. This school graciously loaned a classroom, though I'm sure they had none to spare. They loaned a classroom for a whole year, and the first classes for the girls, the first year was only a girls' school. The boys later in the year started being allowed to come at night, but it was a couple of years before they had boys and girls together. Here's where the Lutheran High School began in 1903. They then moved across the street to a huge modern Gothic building in the 1920s, which worked great until they didn't need it anymore. In the White Flight, they relocated and merged with St. Peter's Lutheran Church, which is out on 76th Street, and now they call it SPI, St. Peter Emmanuel. And this Emmanuel Church is now a Seventh-day Adventist church. 1870, founding of Cross downtown. This is their newer building. They're in the ELCA. Now, it used to be in Missouri. This is one of 3 Missouri Synod churches in the Seminex trouble of the 1970s that bolted the Missouri Synod here in Milwaukee, and they joined the ELCA. This was their famous pastor, Joe Ellwanger, marched with Dr. King. And here's his wife, Joyce. And I wanted to show you a picture of Joyce because she holds the record for most times having been arrested for a Lutheran pastor's wife. 5. I dare you to find me one that can top that. They were big marchers for social justice, and she probably threw some frozen water bottles at cops or something and made a nuisance of herself and got arrested. 1872, founding of St. Lucas in Bayview, still a very vibrant ministry. There's their beautiful organ. There's their old school. 1873, St. Jacobi on 13th and Mitchell. Here's their magnificent old building. You might recognize their altar. You've probably seen it before. That's their school graduation. They were packing them in, weren't they? Holy smokes. They're holding rolled up diplomas. This, I suppose, could have been confirmation day, but I'm guessing those might be diplomas in their hands, although it could be their confirmation too. That is Pastor Jenny standing up there with his tabs. And that brings us to the end, because this is the original house church that St. Marcus was started in 1875. It has since been moved, re-sided, and reoriented, but the building still exists, which is crazy. I've never seen a photograph from its original 6 years when it was our founding church, but I'll pick it up here next week when we tell the story of St. Marcus. Thank you all for your patience. A lot of material jammed in here. See you next week. Last one next week, and then it's all over.